Hello and welcome to Everybody Podcast. I'm Daria Matza. Today's show, I welcome Dr. Natalie Boero. Dr. Boero is a sociologist, and her book, Killer Fat: Media, Medicine, and Morals in the American Obesity Epidemic really caught my eye, and I knew I wanted to have her on the show. But as we talked in this interview, I learned more about her recent work, which looks at mother blame in the medicalization of fat kids. It's such important work, and so much emerged out of our conversation. So much so that I'm actually going to split this interview into 2 episodes. So part 2 of our conversation will come out next week, and it's in there that we really delve more into the conversation about our new work with kiddos. This interview drives my engines. Dr. Boero expands my views and brings new things to light, all with this underlying foundation of research that really holds it all together. It's a great interview, and I am really excited to share it with you. So let's get started. So how did your interest in this topic begin?
It really started when I was in I guess it was my first or second year of graduate school. And I was taking a social movements class, and we were, we had to write a paper about a different social movement. And for some reason, I had just started to hear about the fat acceptance movement, which is not something I had really known about before. And I sort of started looking through some of the older fat activist literature, some of the sort of foundational texts of fat activism, I guess you'd say. And I really it both piqued my interest personally and intellectually. I've been fat my whole life. And so it was something that sort of opened a lot of doors for me. And so I wrote a master's thesis on fat activism and fat activists, and how people come to fat activism, how people come to identify as fat in any sort of a positive or neutral way. But what I really decided as I went along with that, is I really decided that actually what I was more interested in was a lot of what, so this was 97, 98, was what a lot of the activists were telling me was that they felt like, a lot of where they were seeing fat stigma most, or where they were seeing fat stigma grow, was really in discussions about the obesity epidemic, or within medical settings, with the expansion of various weight loss surgeries. This was right around the time that fen was hot on the market and then taken off, and sort of there was discussion about how disposable fat bodies were. And while there was, still all of this discussion about stigma and access and, job and housing discrimination and sexism, what it really sort of struck me was just how much people who had been active as fat activists for quite a while were talking about medicine and health, and the way the media was reporting on this, and the way that diet companies were sort of reorienting themselves to be kind of quote unquote health focused, rather than simply focused on weight loss for appearance reasons or social reasons. And so I decided I would kind of move away from the activism thing. So then for my dissertation, I decided to go and really look at, okay, so not just how did we come to call obesity an epidemic, but what does it mean to call obesity an epidemic? And then how do people experience that? How does that either change or shape people's experience of being fat at a time when fatness isn't just seen as a personal flaw or an appearance blemish, but really seen as something that is, it's really not hyperbole to say that the way the media has covered it really kind of threatening the public health of the nation and the world, right?
Right.
At that point, there really wasn't a whole lot written within sociology about fatness. There was some, and there were a lot of kind of activist texts, but there really wasn't a whole lot of sort of fat studies literature out there yet. And so it took a little bit of convincing to get my dissertation chair to sign on to let me do this project. But I did, obviously, and it took me quite a while. And, I've sort of been working on various offshoots of that for most of my career now.
So was Killer Fat, the book that you wrote, your dissertation?
Yes, it was initially my dissertation. And then, when I sent it out to publishers, I took a lot of the more sort of theoretical academic pieces out of it.
Mm-hmm. Have you been involved then in the new emergence of the fat studies as a academic program that's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I have not taught a fat studies course in the sense of it being called fat studies, but I'm very much kind of connected with that community. And I was honored to be able to have a piece in the Fat Studies Reader, which really sort of laid the groundwork for fat studies as an interdisciplinary project. I was a member of the original editorial board of the Fat Studies Journal, the editor-in-chief being Esther Rothblum. Last year, Patty Thomas, who is a sociologist in Nevada, she and I co-edited a special issue of the Fat Studies Journal on fat kids.
Yeah. Is there any school yet that has that as a degree?
No, I don't believe so. I could be wrong, but I know people are starting to actually have fat studies courses.
Yeah, that's a great start.
Yeah. And I mean, every once in a while you see some article that, in the mainstream press about how ridiculous it would be to have a fat studies course, but
Right.
accepted.
Yeah. Well, let's go back a little bit to your work and the idea of the epidemic, calling obesity an epidemic. It's funny because both of those words to me are so problematic, right? And then you put them together and it's a bit of a mess. So can you tell us a little bit about how, I guess it's our government that came to call obesity an epidemic? Who named that? The government or the media?
It was really a media thing, and it's very hard to trace back. And I don't know that Abigail Segui maybe had traced it back, but I don't know that I've ever really found the definitive first usage of it, of the term. But I do know that in the early 1990s, it started to be prevalent in the media. Public health literature was a little bit later, so I suspect it was more of a media designation than anything. And you're absolutely right. These words like obesity, which is a disease designation, or like overweight, which is normative, right?
Right.
Are, very problematic. And I usually use them in quotes or brackets or things like that. And obviously the idea of epidemic was problematic for a number of ways, both because, or interesting at least for a number of ways. One of my main subfields within sociology is the sociology of health and illness. So I've been interested in trends like medicalization, which is this process by which we see previously non-medical issues in medical terms and subject to medical interventions. In looking at the word epidemic, I was really kind of interested in both how does and does not the word epidemic used in regards to obesity match the traditional sort of biomedical definition of an epidemic.
Can you pause for a minute and tell us what is a definition of an epidemic, since you seem
That's a good one. Basically, standard medical definition is that it is a disease that is prevalent within a widespread area in a given time that is both communicable and in need of containment. And so I think that things like the widespread, the incurable and need of containment, and communicable are kind of the main issues right there. And obviously, fatness is none of those things.
Right.
Using the term epidemic to describe increased body weight really has the effect of creating a sense of urgency, marginalizing a population, and also allowing for a type of moral panic where we can rush to approve things like fen-phen,
right,
or untested weight loss surgeries in the name of containing an epidemic, right?
Right.
It's worth the risk to put these potentially dangerous things out there because this epidemic is spreading so rapidly.
Right.
And it also, I mean, I think it is part of a greater trend of medicalization in our society in terms of using the types of terms, medical terms to describe social issues, right? We talk about epidemics of violence or things like that.
Right, yeah.
But I think that it really was a critical shift in how we evaluated body size and what we subjected people to on the basis of that designation. I think that it also shifted the stigma away from a more personal stigma, one that was rooted more in psychological stereotypes, to one where fat people became to bear the brunt of a lot of society's problems, right?
Like what? Give me an example there.
Well, increased healthcare costs.
Right. Mm-hmm.
People using sick days. Airlines have blamed weight increases for increased fuel costs.
Right.
So I think that the shift then went that, you know, as those who are among the impacted by an epidemic, fat people come to be seen as spreading this. It was no accident that it happened at this time where we were seeing a lot, you know, sort of the rise of neoliberalism and the push towards individual responsibility for public health and a shift away from public responsibility for public health.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting too, that word. I was thinking about other epidemics that I know of, and kind of that idea of that when whatever group is causing the epidemic, the isolation that has to occur to separate them from the larger group to protect the health. And
right.
I feel like that's what's happened to fat people in a lot of ways. Like they're not accepted as part of the, you know, the larger healthy community. It's like this isolation has happened. And I don't know if it's just from that word, but it struck me when I thought about those two connections, that piece of isolation.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is. And obviously it's not literal in the case of sort of cordoning people off the way it is with traditional biomedical epidemics. But I think it really is in terms of stigma and in terms of, you know, leaving people out of efforts to increase health in ways that are non-stigmatizing. I think it also, you know, something that I've talked a lot about is that there are also really gendered and raced and classed elements to talking about an obesity epidemic, right? That also talking about an obesity epidemic becomes a way to talk about things like race without talking about race.
Yeah, give us an example of that.
Well, for example, I mean, I think a lot of discussion has happened around how obesity is more concentrated in poor and or minority communities, particularly African American and Latino communities, and that has come to be, you know, a reason for targeting those communities or a reason for blaming those communities for their own poverty or ill health, rather than looking at the structural conditions that create poverty and ill health, right? The structural conditions, both in terms of the close association, though not one for one, between race and ethnicity and social class, as well as, again, this push to blame individual communities for the issues and our unwillingness to look at the type of structural conditions that do, in fact, account for racial disparities in health. And I think that, you know, I've written a lot about, or not a lot about, but I have written about how we often blame mothers as sort of transmitters of this epidemic, right? Because of fat mothers having, you know, maybe having fat kids, or even non-fat mothers, more average sized mothers having fat kids, and laying this on them. And in fact, African American and Latina mothers have been specifically targeted in discussions of childhood obesity. In many, many contradictory ways. But I think that especially then when you add the panic of this is killing our children to the recipe, you know, you get even more of a focus there. Yeah,
absolutely. What was your opinion of Michelle Obama's plate? What else do we call it?
Her, what was it called? Let's Move campaign.
Let's Move. There we go. Yes.
Gosh, I miss her.
No, it's like, it's hard to even criticize it because
I know.
it was even the problems with it. It's like, but
Right.
what if they were still here?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that if we had simply taken a focus on weight out of that program, it would have been great. I think that there's nothing wrong with encouraging kids to eat more fresh food and fruit and vegetables. There's nothing wrong with encouraging kids to, exercise more and enjoy their bodies and use
find
their
pleasure
body.
in movement. Yeah, find pleasure in movement for sure.
But to focus on it as a way to either prevent or control quote unquote childhood obesity, I think is actually pretty self-defeating, because what we know is that size-related stigma is internalized very young, especially by girls, and that stigma, in fact, keeps people sometimes from doing the types of things that Michelle Obama was encouraging them to do. And so I wish that we really could have had a weight-neutral focus in that case. And it's also true that, we live in an era of convenience food, of fast food, of all of these things. I mean, when you see kids walking down the streets eating potato chips and drinking sodas after school, they're not all fat kids.
Right.
They're not all fat kids. In fact, probably most of them aren't. And so I think that, it both puts the onus on fat kids and on the other hand makes us think that the real issue is weight rather than things like access to safe places to play, access to nutritious food.
Right.
So that was my main problem with Michelle Obama's campaign. And then, the sociologist in me also knows that when we look at racial and socioeconomic disparities in health, in fact, a relatively small percentage of those disparities can be explained by personal behavior.
Mm-hmm. Right. I was listening to you earlier, like I said, and you mentioned one of my nemesises, which is Walmart, and its involvement in it. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that here, because I thought it actually exemplified a lot of the problem pretty clearly.
What did I say about Walmart?
Well, you just said that Walmart was the sponsor. Instead of saying, have Walmart sponsor Michelle Obama, teaching kids to lose weight by moving, what about Walmart paying people a living wage?
Right, giving people living wage, giving people access to
healthcare
and preventive care, allowing parents time to be off and taking care of their children and being present and not having to work 3 different jobs, right? So that's the thing, is I just think that a focus on weight narrows our scope in a way that turns us away from more systemic determinants of health and more systemic inequalities. And I don't think that is an accident in a time where we're really not investing in public health, public infrastructure, poverty-related programs, different kinds of food distribution, et cetera. So it's kind of like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, isn't there some pretty compelling research about the effects of socioeconomic racism on people's health?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm teaching a medical sociology class this semester, and we have just been reading David Williams, who's a sociologist and social epidemiologist at Harvard. And his work basically focuses on social distribution of health and social determinants of health. And what his findings, in the United States, socioeconomic status is the single greatest determinant of how long people will live. So that socioeconomic status is the single biggest predictor of life expectancy in the United States. We can't blame racial disparities in health completely on social class. And so he, in fact, finds that, there's this independent effect of racism, and he links it to things like residential segregation, which results in the type of environmental racism in terms of what people are exposed to. It results in things like different quality schools in different neighborhoods, et cetera. And so his basic argument is that all policy is health policy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And he kind of builds off the work by Paula Lance and her co-authors. I think it was 2000 or 1999. I could get it for you. Had an article in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, that basically looked at how much of the socioeconomic discrepancy in health outcomes could be attributed to individual behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Well, basically the idea is that, they took a number of different behaviors, which they called body BMI a behavior, which I had a problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
But they took into account BMI, education, income, diet, smoking, drinking, forget what else. But basically what they found is that, in fact, while it's true that behaviors like smoking and drinking and alcohol consumption appear to be more common among people of lower socioeconomic status, that when you control for those, you still see people in lower socioeconomic status dying earlier, right? So basically, if you have an upper middle class fat person and a working class fat person, all things being similar, the working class person is still going to die earlier.
Right. And if you had a working class skinny person and an upper class skinny person, the
working class person die earlier on average. And so they controlled for all of these things. And basically what they found is that only about 14% of social disparities in life expectancy by social class could be explained by personal behaviors. Meaning that while it is great to tell people to eat their vegetables and I am big proponent of not smoking, and getting physical activity, even if everybody did all of these things, we wouldn't see that social gap, that class-based gap in life expectancy close. In fact, it would only shorten a very small bit.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are Americans actually getting fatter over time?
Average weights have gone up, yeah.
But so have heights, right?
Heights have, weights have, and we can talk a lot about why. Some of it is due to better nutrition, and some of it is due probably to not so good nutrition. We obviously live in a society where we have a very different orientation to physical activity than we once did, perhaps. We also live in a society that now has gone through, 75 years of chronic dieting. Yeah. And we also know that yo-yo dieting increases weights.
I keep thinking about that as I'm ongoing with the podcast about, we know that dieting increases weights in people. And it seems like in the 60s and 70s is when the diet boom really began.
1950s too.
Okay.
I would say post-war.
Yeah, post-war. But it really ramped up, right, in the 70s, it seems like.
Mm-hmm. And it's not coincidental that the focus on that sort of ramped up alongside or shortly after sort of the highest point of the feminist movement either.
Right. Yeah. How come?
In the sense that oftentimes, there's a backlash, right? That as women step forward and assert more power, we often see a retrenchment in terms of, policies or products that then highlight or seem to valorize, some sort of normative femininity.
Right.
So, for example, a colleague of mine, Elizabeth Sweet, does research on toys and toy advertisements. Mm-hmm. And, she found that in the 1980s, you see so much more gender neutral toys and gender neutral advertising. And then into the 90s, you really start to see, the Disney princesses, and everything has a pink version of it and all of this stuff. And a lot of that is sort of, she argues not one for one, but sort of part of a cultural reassertion of feminine norms at a time when women have asserted more or gained more social and economic power, although not equal social and economic power in the United States.
Sure. Well, do you think that's a valid point to be made about perhaps the weight gain is from this chronic dieting that, like, more so than the soda companies and like all these, super size me of McDonald's?
Right. I call that obesity epidemic porn.
You know what's so funny? I love that you just said that, because I'm a filmmaker and I was just revisiting some of the things in Super Size Me, that documentary. And I was remembering how horrible it was that they were like blocking out, as if it was porn, the people's faces of fat people walking by the screen. I don't know if you remember, if you saw the movie or if you remember it, but they were basically like showing fat people with blackout.
Right, the headless fatty phenomenon.
Headless fatty, yes.
Who and I didn't coin that term, but like who would want to be associated with that? And it's like, news media, all of that stuff really sort of and again, that sort of reinforces that who would ever want to be associated with that body, that it's something to be ashamed of and it's something to hide and it's a stain both personally and on society, right? Because, while we've medicalized, quote unquote, obesity, we haven't medicalized it in the sense that we don't think of it as people's fault, right? We still have that moral element to it.
Right.
And in fact, maybe even predominantly a moral thrust to it.
What do you think about the ways people blame the various food industries?
A couple of things. I think that it is a problem how we produce and distribute food in this society. I think that while I try not, I don't put a moral value on food, I do think that people should have more opportunity or more access to different options in food. I think that both from an economic justice, a racial justice, and environmental justice standpoint, we really have to think about how, and a workers' justice standpoint, right? Because the way that we process and create food is not necessarily good for the people who work in those industries either. So I absolutely think that we definitely need a major overhaul in how we produce and distribute food in this country and globally. That said, I do not support things like soda taxes, mainly because
neither does New York, apparently, which is...
Pardon?
I said neither does New York.
Right.
Yep.
Oakland, unfortunately, does.
Oh, wow.
And Berkeley, of course.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think that also a lot of the fat phobia in the sort of slow food or food justice movements really alienates a lot of potential allies. That I'm against soda taxes for a number of reasons. First of all, they're regressive, right? Mm-hmm. They tax the poor disproportionately. They really don't. I mean, it may curb consumption a little, but it's really going to be difficult to show if they cause any reduction in weight over time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it also targets fat people as the problem. And again, it's one of those things that narrows our focus to one little thing and really does nothing about larger structural issues. And to me, until we can grapple with that, we're not going to get anywhere. We're just going to continue to stigmatize and blame fat kids. I saw these advertisements or these billboards recently in San Francisco. Just something about the relationship between sugar intake, sugary sodas and the obesity epidemic, or, fat kids or something. And I just thought, I can't imagine being a kid these days and constantly being barraged with that stuff. And I have a fat kid and we talk about all of this stuff. And so while I think that there are lots of reasons to rethink how we produce and distribute food in this society, I know that a focus on fatness is not going to change any of that.
Right, because that conversation about food politics and food lobbies and the school lunches, all these things, is really a conversation about health for the entire public, not just fat kids or fat people.
Right. And I think it gives people who are thinner a false sense of security.
Mm-hmm.
Not that people should constantly be having anxiety about their health, right?
Right.
But in the sense of, it's sort of this one measure that then we attribute everything to. It's so class-based, right? Because I was thinking this the other night. I was at this, I live in Oakland and ever gentrifying Oakland. And, we have a great foodie culture here in the Bay Area. And like, there's always someplace new to go. And I'm like, I had ordered this chicken dish at this restaurant in Berkeley. And, it's like free range and organic and whatever. It had a name. I knew the chicken's name. Not really. But anyway. And I remember thinking, like, I was looking, like, they were talking about how, it's like basted in butter and all of this stuff. And I'm like, we really don't get on wealthy people about how they are eating. Oh, isn't it great that the whole food movement is going back to lard and all of these things?
Right.
And, yeah, we really have a lot of food moralism that specifically grafts onto poor people and people of color in a way that it just doesn't attach to elites or even sort of middle class people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell me how good foie gras is for you.
Yeah, seriously. And how good foie gras is for the earth.
Right. Exactly. And animals.
Yeah.
And, I was even talking about this with my students the other day. It's like what is and isn't nutritious also depends on what is and isn't available. Right. So that like a Big Mac could be more or less nutritious depending on what you have access to. Right.
Right.
In a certain way, if you're a kid who's not getting enough calories in a day or any of this stuff, and you live in a food desert, unfortunately, that may be pretty solid nutrition for you.
Right. Yeah. It's huge. It's huge. What about the addiction model that's kind of being sold right now related to sugar?
Right. I mean, I think that the whole addiction model is is another example of medicalization and the extension of that kind of, just like epidemic, addiction has become a word that we throw around pretty easily. Things like sugar addicts or porn addicts or sex addicts or love addicts or caffeine addicts or whatever. So I'm skeptical of the language. There are a lot of people with a lot of interest in this debate, and I do not know a lot of the science behind it. However, I do know that demonizing certain food groups rarely has any good outcomes. There is probably a lot of added sugar in the foods that we eat. I think that I don't know what too much is, but I think that maybe we get too much sugar. I think that sugar is something that people like, and to the extent that people like and crave certain things, maybe they're more likely to eat it. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily think that I would call that an addiction.
Yeah.
We're a country of extremes, right? So it's like you have to call, instead of just saying, maybe I'm eating a little too much sugar and eating a little less sugar, people have to like go on Atkins or go caveman.
Cleanse. Go on.
Or this cleanse, which is like a completely ridiculous word. And if there is one term that I hate in the world, it is the term clean eating.
Oh, it's so bad.
I want to scream and rage every time I hear that word.
Yeah, it's so bad.
Like, could we ever get more moralistic than that? As a fat woman that sort of finds myself in a demographic where fat people aren't as common, and where, you have all these Bay Area parents who are completely concerned about all of this stuff and micro analyzing and navel gazing about food. It's kind of an awkward position to be in sometimes. Although it was interesting. A lot of the parents that I'm in touch with and that are friends and things like that, people often talk about sugar highs, kids getting sugar highs.
Yeah.
And I was like, I feel like I've read someplace that actually the sugar high isn't a thing.
Uh-huh.
And in fact, there's plenty of evidence that there really is no such thing as a sugar high.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so, there's this one meta study that showed that, and that people attribute it more to like kids being excited about special occasions. And that kids, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Kids hear parents and teachers talk about sugar highs, and then when they eat sugar, it becomes a reason to, behave kind of crazy.
It's like the placebo effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I posted this article. I posted a link to the study on Facebook. And it was really interesting because in this era where educated, liberal, left coast, semi-elite kind of people are like all about science. We got to start trusting science again,
Yep.
all the, with the stuff about climate change and not believing science. We're all like, nope, I don't believe this. Watch my kid eat sugar and go nuts.
Right.
And I kind of felt like, okay, so while I'm often skeptical of science because I don't think science is ever purely objective or uninterested, like it's very interesting how quick we are to reject some science when it doesn't confirm what we think we know.
Mm-hmm.
I think for a certain class of parents, micromanaging food is what passes for good parenting in an era where parents have less time with their kids because they're working a lot.
Yeah.
And less control over their kids' everyday activities.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
So, but back to the issue of sugar addiction, I don't necessarily, and that's the thing. So like, no, I don't give my kids as much soda as they would drink if I let them drink it. I don't, have a giant dish of candy out in the house at all times. I don't judge parents who do, but I feel like, yeah, I myself limit sugar to some extent. So then the extreme becomes that we never do this, or we stress over it, or we micromanage it. And it's similar to me, it's similar with the physical activity thing, right? It's like people feel like going from being relatively physically inactive to being more physically active has to be this dramatic thing, right? They have to get up and run a 5K. They have, the half marathon is the new midlife crisis.
Right.
They have to be in the gym at a spin class 6 days a week, right?
Mm-hmm.
So nobody's really satisfied with like, hey, I'm going to go for a 30-minute walk 3 or 4 times a week.
Right.
That doesn't feel sort of dramatic and life-changing and extreme enough. And so then people sort of try and make these radical shifts that then really aren't sustainable. And then they feel like failures.
That feeling of failure actually contributes to your health more negatively than perhaps, many other things.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of research on stress and health. And, for me, it's like I get asked a lot about things like, well, but isn't this unhealthy or isn't that unhealthy? Or what about health? And I don't necessarily have all the medical answers or all the medical knowledge, but I do know that most people who express concern about the health of fat people couldn't give a shit about the health of fat people.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they did give a shit about the health of fat people, they would care about us being treated like human beings, us not being constantly shamed or stigmatized, us having access to good health care, et cetera. And so I think that, the health thing just becomes a mask for giving free rein to really stigmatize fat people.
Right. It lends itself to the whole healthism thing that we see everywhere.
Exactly. And so there are absolutely, and I believe this, whether the extent to which this is true and how exactly and the origins of this, I think are debatable and we don't really have good data on. But there are absolutely some health-related issues that appear to be more common in people of higher weights.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like that's not any sort of a gotcha question for me.
Right.
However, none of these things are not also found in thin people.
Mm-hmm.
And you cannot divorce the health of fat people from the way healthcare is delivered to fat people.
Yes.
And so, if you really want to talk about, well, what does it mean that fat people appear to have higher rates of type 2 diabetes? Well, if you really want to talk to me about that, let's talk about how doctors interact with fat people. Let's talk about how the linkages between poverty and weight. Let's talk about stigma around activity and let's talk about the role of constant stress that comes from social stigma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So talk about the fact that, I know for me in my adult life, every single time I walk into a medical office, they want to check my blood sugar, even though I've never I've never had any symptoms.
Right. That's what, I had a doctor on, and she was saying, in her opinion, it's more the rates are so much higher because doctors always test the fat people and they don't always test the thinner people.
Right. And so thinner people tend to find out later.
Right.
And so I think, just like breast cancer rates shot up when mammography machines became more available, it's not because anybody had more breast cancer or much more. It's an artifact of testing.
Right.
And so I'm not willing to say that there's no association, but I think we need to look into the association, and the association may not be and likely isn't completely reducible to body size.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And, then part of me thinks people will talk about the good fatty.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, for those who don't know what a good fatty is, will you describe?
Well, the good fatty, and I think so far I've managed to be the good fatty, is the fatty that exercises, eats lots of vegetables, is able-bodied, doesn't have any of those illnesses or issues that are supposedly correlated with body weight. You sort of get a little bit of a pass, or people will say, well, okay, that's for you, the kind of fat and fit people. But what about the 500-pound or 600-pound person, or what about that? And I think to myself too, well, I like to exercise and I like to eat, fruits and vegetables, and I love to eat ice cream, and drink wine. But I always think about well, I'm getting older. Chances are that no matter what size I am, at some point I'm going to have one of these things. And does that then, I need to check myself and make sure that not too much of my identity rests on being the good fatty, because I think human value should never be predicated on health.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
I also think that, most of us at some point experience some kind of chronic condition as we age. And so, don't get too used to it or whatever.
Right.
It's just another form of privilege, right? And frankly, my being the quote unquote good fatty probably has a lot to do with my class and race privilege, in the sense that, I have the resources to do certain things, or I have the absence of other privileges that sort of blunt some of the other stigmas I've experienced. So that's kind of the good fatty thing, which is another thing. It's so that's my thing, is that there's we shouldn't judge moral worth based on health anyway. So that needs to be out of the conversation.
Absolutely. So that concludes the first part of my interview with Dr. Boero. Remember to stay tuned next week for the next part. And thank you for listening today. I am so grateful that you are here. Remember to get in touch through email, Facebook, or Instagram. I always love hearing from you. Because remember, this podcast is for everybody.